in particular, not 4 days, not 5 days, not 2 days, 3 days. The Bible clearly lays that out and says Abraham went up to Moriah, and it was the third day when on the third day he returned back. So that's very important. Where do we get the 3 days from? Of course, if you are a Jewish person who knows how the first century Jewish thought was, the idea wasn't to find a statement which says the Messiah will rise up on the third day necessarily alone, but the idea was to see, is there any revelation in the Hebrew scriptures which we can put together to get this idea of 3 days. And that's what we get from Abraham and Isaac, Mount Moriah, third day return back. Abraham thought for 3 days his son was dead, but God himself gave his own son. In the place of Abraham giving his son Isaac, God gave Jesus, third day rose up from the dead. Now, going back to his point about Paul's vision, Apostle Paul's vision, may I please comment before him by reading that, if I have time, by reading...
Take your time, if you don't, this goes over to number.
So, by reading that specific narration which Paul had. Paul, in the narration of what happened to him, and as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light shone around from heaven. Paul did not describe a vision there. He says that light shone around him from heaven. Then he fell to the ground and heard a voice. So it wasn't just a light, it was also a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? So Paul is seeing a light, he is hearing a voice, and he had fallen down already. And Paul responds back. He did not say, I'm just seeing a vision, I can't interact, but he is interacting. He says, who are you, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you were persecuting. It is hard for you to kick against the goads. So he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what do you want me to do? And the Lord said to him, arise and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. And the men who journeyed with him stood speechless. Our friend Paul here said the friends did not experience anything. Let me please correct him by reading the very passage he read, where it clearly says, and the men who journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice. The men around him did not see the light, but they heard a voice, but seeing no one. As a matter of fact, if we combine this with the other place where Paul gives a detail about this, the idea is they did not see a face, but they heard a light and heard a sound. Everyone experienced, more crucially Paul. Sorry, I took more time.
No, that's fine. I don't mind you. You can take more time. Some limit to even say. Thank you for that. Good. That's quite a strong response, which I respect that. I'm going to make a controversial, polemical point now, which may not go down very well, but it needs to be said from my point of view. My friend here is using the King James Bible. The King James Bible, as any academic will tell you, if you study this academically, is not a translation you use, because it's out of date, and most importantly, it's been heavily corrupted, particularly in the Old Testament. It's incorporating Christian ideas, it's given Christian translations of the Hebrew, which are not in the Hebrew. And there are many examples of this, unfortunately, and my friend has just given one. And he was controversial, it's not very popular, but I wanted to say that because modern translators now, mainstream ones, like the NRSV, are aware of this bias in the older translations, and they know, and they have corrected the mistranslations and the tendentious interpretations of the Jewish Bible, and now they give more accurate translations. And I want to share with you probably the most accurate translation of all. And that's why you get a difference between what we're saying. I'm quoting from the most accurate academic modern translation. He is quoting from a translation which has been interpolated by Christian scholars in the 16th century, when most people didn't know any better. So when it says in Psalm 16, when he says, it says the Holy One shall not see corruption, and it's talking about someone else. In the modern Bible, which doesn't have these Christian biases, it says this: therefore my heart is glad and my soul rejoices. My body also rests secure. Therefore you do not give me up to Sheol, nor let your faithful one see the pit. So the first person is not there in his older Christianized Hebrew Bible, but it is here in my modern, more neutral, academic, objective and scholarly translation. But this is very convenient for Christians because they can read Christian theology out of it because the translators in English have already spun it for them. I knew it was a bit controversial, I've said my piece. So, now coming back to your other point, and I'm surprised you make your point for me. He quotes the road to Damascus again, and he says Paul had a vision, had through a light, of course he does, and Paul hears a voice, yes he does. And then, but the men saw no one. Even in his King James Version, the men saw no one. And that's my point. Jesus rose from the dead, he appeared to one man, everyone else with him saw nothing. What kind of resurrection is that? It's not a resurrection that you should base a world religion on, where you trust the visionary experiences of a man that no one else can share. No one else saw what Paul saw, and yet a religion is based on this. How can we base it on an experience that no one else can share? This is not a very solid foundation.
Because we're Christians.
Because you're Christians, yes, I know. Yeah. So that is, in my view, the weakness of today's gospel message. That it's based on a visionary experience that no one else saw. That was only experienced in Paul's mind. I don't doubt he had it. But we could base all sorts of religions on visionary experiences and say it's from God. It's not a very objective, historically sound foundation to base a religion on. Therefore, we should not base our lives on it. We cannot base our children and our homes and our souls on an experience that we cannot have ourselves, because Jesus has now gone to heaven. He's no longer resurrected, he's now gone to heaven. So I'm afraid that the argument for the resurrection of Jesus is surprisingly weak, and I give up my minute to you.
Thank you for the generous gesture. Okay, now our dear friend Paul now runs and hides behind evaluation by modern day scholars about English translation of some Old Testament prophecies. I'd like to comment before him. We can discuss in detail about all sorts of translations if you want to, but maybe at a later date. Today, for the sake of simplicity, may I please comment before our friend Paul, maybe we don't even need the English translations. We'd go back to the Greek wordings and the Greek evaluation of first century apostles. And I'm going to read to you from Acts chapter 2, continuing with where Peter introduced this idea. Verse 29, or maybe I should do verse 27. For you will not leave my soul in Hades, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. According to him, it's not corruption, it's something else. Maybe, may not be. But Peter goes on, skipping a verse there, I'm going to verse 29. Men and brethren, let me speak freely to you of the patriarch David, that he is both dead and buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. Therefore, being a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that of the fruit of his body, according to the flesh, he would raise up the Christ to sit on his throne. He, foreseeing this, spoke concerning the resurrection of the Christ. In other words, we could go to the underlying Greek text which Peter used, in this case, as recorded by Luke, a physician, in the book of Acts, and their point, ignoring King James, ignoring any other translation, quite clear, someone who is dead could not have satisfied this, and therefore, this is not talking about King David himself, but rather Messiah prophetically, number one. Number two, our friend Paul here, in reference to the experience of Apostle Paul, over and over again makes a mistake. He says it's a vision.
Paul, would you like a tea? No, it's very kind, but no thank you. Maybe he would like a tea?
No, I'm
He's a bit busy actually, but thank you.
Our friend Paul, he essentially said the Apostle Paul just saw a vision. And to stress that point, he stresses on the one aspect of his experience, which is that just that he saw something no one else saw. I'd like to expand the case. My dear friend, Paul saw a light. He didn't describe that as a vision. And he heard a sound. And everyone else around him heard the sound also. And what it says there, the verse does not say they did not see the light, but it rather says they did not see anyone. In other words, they could not see any perceivable face there. It doesn't say they did not even see the light. just that they did not see anyone, a human being there. Now, my dear friend, and therefore, summing that up, the point is Paul's experience was a real experience involving light and sound, which was experienced by the other people also, and he even became blind because of that. Thank you.
Did they see the light as well?
Excuse me, please don't interrupt.
I'll read the passage.
Please don't interrupt. Thank you.
Okay, back to Acts 26, where Paul, according to Luke, is telling King Agrippa about his experience on the road to Damascus that my Christian friend here has just been talking about. And Paul says this to King Agrippa in verse 19. Acts 26, verse 19. I was not, King Agrippa, disobedient to the heavenly vision. So he does call it a vision, contrary to what you claim. If we're to trust the Bible, maybe it's not true, but at least your Bible says it was a vision. Coming back then to the actual, the story you just mentioned here in Acts 9, the men who were travelling with Paul stood speechless because they heard the voice but saw no one. Now the point about the resurrected Jesus is, he was a bloke walking around who'd been dead. They would have seen him if he'd been resurrected from the dead. That's the whole point. It's not any obscure thing about did they see a light or not. They saw no one. They should have seen a flesh and blood human being walking around. They saw nothing. And it was a heavenly vision, and it was Paul's own resurrection appearance. And Paul says in Acts 1 Corinthians 15, he appeared to Peter, to James, to everyone else, and last of all, he appeared to me. So we know, I would argue, that all of the appearances were visions. To Peter, to James, to the 500, they were all visions. And how can this be, you say? How can people have collective visions? But they do. Ask in Portugal, in Fatima, go to Medjugorje, go to other places where Mary has appeared to thousands of people. Just Google it, I've looked it up. Collective massive hallucinations of dead people happen in the 20th century. I'm not surprised it happened thousands of years ago in a backwater of the Roman Empire. It does not surprise me in the slightest. Then he quotes Peter in Acts 2. I'm sorry, but usually when the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, it alters the translation. It twists and turns and makes things up. And the most notorious case that biblical scholars will tell you about is Hebrews chapter 10, which is actually talking about the incarnation of God, the incarnation of the Son. Sacrifice and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, and then there's a quote from the Psalm, sacrifice and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. So a body had been prepared for Jesus. Wow, and it's quoting from a Psalm, a prophecy, surely. But no, all you've got to do is you check it in the Old Testament, look up the Psalm, and guess what? It doesn't mention a body, it mentions an ear. It's really weird, thank you. An ear. Because what scholars will tell you, the New Testament is quoting from the Septuagint, the Greek translation, which itself is a bad translation of the Hebrew original. The New Testament is quoting from a bad translation, which sometimes gets the original Hebrew wrong, badly wrong. I reference you to James Barr, Professor of Hebrew at Oxford University, in his monograph on this very subject, which I've read and studied. Hebrews gets it wrong, and it quotes a bad translation. But of that bad translation, you have made doctrine and a false prophecy. It's not there in the Hebrew Bible. And this is typical, I'm afraid, of the New Testament. You may respond to that.
Thank you very much.
Okay, assertions repeated, no explanation given. The point was pretty simple in regards to Paul. Now, our friend Paul now made a huge leap, which I was very surprised to see. He said, Paul says it's a vision, and therefore everyone else saw visions. Now, I'm curious, if everyone else saw visions, what explains the empty tomb? What explains the fact that Jews in the first century, according to the book of Matthew, according to Matthew himself, had to find an empty tomb, and the only explanation they could come up with was that the disciples stole the body and they were trying to spread around a lie. Now, this in the context of few things, which is number one, Roman soldiers guarding the tomb. Number two, expert religious Jewish people were on the case on top of the Romans. And number three, body not found. There's only one thing which can explain all these three combined together, which is Jesus had risen up. Whether you'd like to describe what Paul saw as a vision or not, that's a secondary thing. Jesus had risen up purely outside of Paul's experiences. Also, empty tomb, while the guards were guarding the tomb, when the Jewish leadership was also on the case. Nothing else can explain apart from the fact that the body had risen up from being dead. Now, going to his jump from, none of the other apostles saw Jesus in the bodily form. Unfortunately though, his conclusion was based on an idea, a logic which goes something like this. This is Paul's experience and therefore everyone else had a similar experience. I'd like to clarify, excuse me my dear friends, Paul's experience was quite unique. Peter's experience and the rest of the apostles' experience was quite different. Peter and the apostle and the person who was called the man who Jesus loved went to an empty tomb. Peter had dinner with Jesus after he had risen up. Peter had seen Jesus ascend up into the heavens, and the angels responding by saying, why do you even look at this like this? Because the one who ascended up likewise is going to return back. In other words, apostles outside of Paul had varied experiences which could only be explained as experiences from a bodily resurrected Jesus Christ. And the same was seen by Mary Magdalene and many other people, as how Paul puts it, 500 people at one time. At even one specific time, 500 people. Now my dear friends, the fact of the matter is Jesus' resurrection is fundamental to the Christians' belief, and it is for the fact that they saw this openly, honestly, in the way they could verify as bodily resurrection, they were willing to give up their lives. Thank you.
That was good. That was good. Thank you for that. About the empty tomb, this is something that biblical scholars, if you're familiar with the literature, has struck them as something very curious about this letter of Corinthians. Paul, as I say, is the earliest account we have of the resurrection appearances, doesn't mention an empty tomb. Interesting. There's no empty tomb mentioned in the earliest account of Jesus' death and resurrection. And some scholars, not all, have posited that the empty tomb idea is a much later tradition that entered into the Christian story years after Paul. It wasn't part of the original gospel belief. That's the first point. So we can't just assume it was there because Christians believe it's there. It's not mentioned, the empty tomb. Very interesting. And coming back to, you make actually a very good point. It's one that occurred to me some time ago. That was Paul's appearance of the resurrected Jesus the same as the others? Because you talk about, you know, well, Peter had lunch or dinner or 11s or afternoon tea with Jesus. You said something like that, but not afternoon tea. He was an Englishman. But the point is this: that where you're getting these stories from is from the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, well, not Matthew, because there's no resurrection appearances in Mark, rather, but in Matthew, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. These stories were written many, many years after Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. By the traditional dating, 1 Corinthians is written about AD 53, 54, and most scholars today would say Luke was written in the 80s or 90s. Same for Matthew, 80s or 90s. John, even later. We're talking 40 to 50 years later when these stories that you're now combining with Paul's account were actually written. And my theory, and I can't prove it, as I say, my theory is, and you can disagree with it because there's no proof for it, but my theory is the earliest account we have is of a vision which no one else saw. That's what Paul says in Acts, if that's true. But later on, as religious stories do, as myths develop, they become embellished, they get told again, and details are added in the stories. And we can see this in the way Matthew has used Mark even. He adds bits of story in which weren't there in Mark. So I would suggest in the history of religion sense, in the sense of the academic study of all religions, we are used to seeing the embellishment and development of legends around religious figures who are really, really important. And Christianity is no exception to this rule. We see an early vision, thank you, turning into a much more physical story 30, 40, 50, 60 years after 1 Corinthians. And I would say that is most likely to have happened here. The early tradition makes no reference of an empty tomb. The Gospels do, but they're written much, much, much later. And therefore, the question has to be asked, is this a result of legendary embellishment and development, or is it history? And I would say it's the former rather than the latter. Thank you, Douglas.
In terms of dealing with history, our friend Paul here advances a very dangerous idea. He says the earliest account matters and whatever else is not supposed to be as reliable as the earliest one. I'd like to think that is not the way historians look at historical records. If that were the case, you shouldn't even be looking at 1 Corinthians, you should only be looking at the epistle that Paul wrote to Thessalonians, because that's the first epistle that Paul wrote according to some historians. The fact of the matter is this, my dear friend. If my friend were to die, if your friend and my friend were to be buried, and if your friend and my friend, we know where he was buried, and if he wasn't in the grave on the 3rd day, and if we saw him alive on the 3rd day going forward for many days, and then finally also we see him ascend into heaven, how long would we remember that in our lifetimes? That's what I'd like to ask. For our friend Paul here to suggest that Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are not reliable because that was written years after 1 Corinthians, my dear friend, I would, if I saw my friend die and come back alive, I would remember that for my entire life. Entire life, not 10 years, not 15 years, my entire life. Now let me read to you Matthew. Now after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb. Very physical experience, the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat on it. That is a very physical experience that is recorded by Matthew. And then the angel says, the topic that our friend Paul here gave, he is not here, he is risen. He is risen. Recorded by Matthew. Now, if such a very dramatic thing happened in your life, how long would you remember? Our friend Paul here thinks maybe for not long. I'd like to think to the contrary. And therefore, I'd like to commend to you every single writing which is written by witnesses or people who are close to Jesus' life, for us to take every one of them seriously. That's where we get our ideas from. Now, he also suggested that the resurrection, the resurrection idea was an embellished idea which evolved to be true bodily resurrection after quite a while. Unfortunately, though, that is not consistent with the historical records that I had pointed out to you earlier. I had pointed out to you earlier that the early church was persecuted right in Jerusalem, right during or before the time of Tacitus, enough to an extent Tacitus records it. And the early church grew right in Jerusalem according to Tacitus himself. And Tacitus, we know, died in 110, around 110 AD. So the fact of the matter is, by 110 AD, you have church rise up, being persecuted, and then rise up again and go into the wider parts of the world. His ideas do not match up to that evidence that we see.
Just final
Final one. Is he doing the final one?
Okay, oh it is, right, okay. Fine, jolly good. Well, that changes things because I was going to...
Sorry, I've not...
in that case, I'd like... we've got 3 minutes. 3 minutes is long enough, that's okay. Right, okay, this is the last point I can make apparently. So, just say very quickly, it's now the consensus of virtually all modern scholars that Matthew, for example, is not a first-person eyewitness account. It was written in the 2nd generation, long after Jesus, by an unknown Jewish Christian writer. Likewise, Luke's not an eyewitness, obviously. John, but we don't know who wrote the Gospel of John, it's anonymous. Mark, we don't know who wrote Mark, doesn't claim to be, none of the Gospels claim to be eyewitnesses, and that is, so we can't rely on them as somehow, oh, I remember in my youth, Jesus said this to me. That's not how modern scholars understand it, and even conservative scholars say the same thing. About the embellishment issue, I'll just give two examples. In Mark, the earliest Gospel, according to most scholars, we have Mary being spoken of as an unbeliever. In Mark chapter 3, she is one of those, in verse 21, who went out to restrain Jesus because he is out of his mind. And in verse 31, mothers and brothers came and they sent to him, calling him to come out. And Jesus said, but who are my mother and my brothers? You are my mothers and brothers who are sitting with me. Very distancing. And then, but notice, by the 2nd century, Mary has been called the Mother of God. And today, most Christians call Mary the Queen of the universe, the spouse of the Holy Spirit. Now, you may shake your head, and I agree with you, it is a terrible thing, but these are most Christians today. Yeah. So we see a extraordinary trajectory from a very lowly, she's an unbeliever in Mark, to today, she's virtually the 4th person of a quaternity, a Trinity plus 1. So I think we can see religious development on an incredible scale. Let me give you a final example of the embellishment that is universally seen as a made-up story in the Gospel of Matthew. It's called, I call it, the zombie apocalypse. Yeah. The zombie apocalypse. Okay, this is quite well known. Now, this takes place at the death of Jesus on the cross. Okay, it is only found, I'll tell you why this is significant. I'll just tell you what the verse says. It's in 2 verses. At the moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs were also opened and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After the resurrection, they came out of the tombs. After their resurrection, they came out of the tombs, entered the holy city, and appeared to many. Wow, the zombies are alive. They walk around Jerusalem. They appear to their families. Now, what is odd about this public event in Jerusalem in broad daylight, where many, many people walk around, is that no one else in recorded history anywhere has ever heard of this event. Acts doesn't mention it. Thank you. Acts doesn't mention it. Josephus, Tacitus, Luke, Matthew rather, Mark, Paul. No one mentions this. Surely this is more fantastic, more amazing than even the alleged resurrection of Jesus, because these were zombies who walked around Jerusalem, and yet there's no corroborating evidence. This almost certainly, according to the vast majority of scholars, is a legend that's made up. Even someone like Mike Licona, thank you. I'll have another 15 seconds if you don't mind. Mike Licona, the famous American apologist, evangelical, so he admits that this is probably not historical. If Matthew can make this stuff up, what else did he make up? And my final point is this. It has not been demonstrated today, Paul's claim, thank you, that in the Jewish scriptures, the Messiah would die and rise again on the 3rd day in accordance with the Jewish scriptures. I have read nowhere, and Jonah is not an example. Jonah, by the way, in the whale, Jonah did not die. He was alive. He was alive throughout the whole experience. Yes. Jesus, in your belief, was dead, so Jonah cannot be the answer. But anyway, I can go on, I don't want to get more discussion. You may have the final word. Oh, I've had the final word. I've had the final word.
That's where I'm quite upset that you raised many new points in what was supposed to be a rebuttal time.
But you know, it was my fault because I didn't know it was my final time. So you may have the final word. Okay. You have the final word. Over to you, sir. You have the final word.
Just maybe quickly, one of the logic that our friend Paul here used to mention.
There is some embellishment about some things in history, and therefore everything else is embellishment. I'd like to say, if you apply the same logic, there are people who lie and therefore everyone is a liar. There are people who kill and therefore everyone is a killer. That doesn't work that way, does it? The point is, I'm not disagreeing that there are some embellishments even about characters which are portrayed in the Bible. I agree. Mary being worshipped, I don't like that. It's not historical as far as I see. But that does not mean Jesus, the life of Jesus, has also been embellished. Now, about earthquakes, now we have sources Thales, Phlegon, and Africanus mention about the supernatural event of the earthquake, and then commenting about that later. So we see that. So I'd like to finally commend before us all, my dear friends, Christian friends of Jesus, Roman non-Christian disciples, historians, Jewish non-Christian historians, Greek non-Christian historians, all of them testifying for bodily resurrection being believed by Christians who were even willing to lay down their lives. We need to explain those fundamental things for us to navigate through this difficult terrain. What explains an empty tomb? What explains persecution of the body of the church in the 1st century, right there in Jerusalem, and people willing to go through it, and the growth of the church beginning with Jerusalem and moving on quite quickly, through vast other portions of the Roman Empire in the 1st century. What explains these things is very crucial for us to understand.
Zombies.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very civilised debate. Thank you very much. Thank you. You're a good chap. Thank you. Thank you, the director here, Mr. Director. And Douglas, who did the time.